Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Omar Al-Ubaydli, who is the Director of Research at Derasat, a think tank in the Kingdom of Bahrain, an affiliated Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, and an affiliated Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. His research interests include political economy, experimental economics, and the economics of the GCC countries. Omar previously served as a member of the Commonwealth of Virginia's Joint Advisory Board of Economists and a visiting professor of economics at the University of Chicago. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you.
I would like to start with your most recent paper entitled The Science of Using Science Towards an Understanding of the Threats to Scalability, in which you say in most government circles, evidence-based programs were once an aspirational goal, then became a gold standard, and now they are the expectation. And researchers have focused almost exclusively on how best to generate data to explore intervention effects and disentangle mechanisms. Yet you say what has been lacking is a scientific understanding of how to make use of the scientific insights generated. So you also say, as academics, you are often perplexed by the science-policy disconnect. Why is so little scholarly research implemented into public policy? Could you talk a little bit about that paper?
Yes. So, as you mentioned, the science has been, or evidence-based policy has become a sort of buzzword in policy circles, especially in Western countries. Yeah. And in fact, one of the manifestations of that is that in many countries, starting with the UK, I believe, what's been called behavioral insights units have popped up, and they're sort of small scientific units, usually independent, which generate policy prescriptions based on what's called nudge theory, or sort of very non-invasive policies and interventions. Simple things like, for example, when you're trying to get people to pick the more prudent pension option, making it the one that's in bold font or the one that's presented to you by default, or when children go to school, putting the healthy food in options closer to them than the unhealthy options. So anyway, all these sorts of policies have become the regular output of behavioral insights units, and behavioral insights units are now very much a functioning component of an active functioning component of modern Western governments. But despite these advances, too often one finds a situation where there is a lot of excitement about implementing a policy, but when it comes to actually, based on some research, but when it comes to the implementation phase, we find that things do not go as was expected based on the research that was promoting this intervention. And this leads to, first of all, wasted resources, and secondly, disenchantment with the scientific process. And that's potentially, I'm not going to say it's the primary reason, that's potentially a contributor to the sort of anti-expert sentiment that's becoming more prominent these days.
Yeah, yeah. And you call it sort of a scale up problem. And you identify three perhaps issues. One is the statistical inference problem. Are we really taking the right choices and action? And then when the policy is more broadly implemented, properties of the population over which those policies are implemented, and then you say properties of the situation. So small experiments in lab sort of experiments show high power, but when you take it to the field for broad implementation, it appears to fail, right?
Right. So yeah, I mean, if you take a simple example, let's say that I did an after-school program that's designed to, improve children's academic outcomes.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll start doing this with, I'll pick a neighborhood at a school. Maybe I'll pick one school, and then I'll run a scientific experiment in that school where I select a group of children who are enrolled in the program, and a group of children who are not.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll compare outcomes, and I'll find that the children who went to the program experienced significantly better outcomes. And then I'll try to apply this. I'll report this to the local school authorities, and maybe even to the federal school authorities if in the US. And then maybe they'll be convinced they'll try to roll this program out at a much larger scale.
Yeah.
And what we find often, not always, but often, is that in the attempt to scale up from this original small-scale experiment to something that is much broader, much more comprehensive, the effect that was detected in the small-scale experiment, that is the reason why people were getting very excited about the program in the first place, diminishes heavily, is heavily attenuated when you roll out the program at the level of the population or at a much higher level. So when you're scaling up, things move back towards zero in terms of detected effects. And as you said, there's various classes of reason for that. The three primary ones we focused on in the paper are firstly, one's relating to statistical inference, which we'll cover a little later. One's relating to the characteristics of the people. One relating to the characteristics of the situation. And these, as I say, understanding, if you want to try to, the scale-up effect is very much a scientific phenomenon which can be studied, and therefore the first step towards dealing with it or to imposing or launching countermeasures is to fully understand it as a concept in of itself.
Yeah, there are some analogous aspects of this in pharmaceuticals, and I often wondered, and I'm just speculating here. I want to get your insights into it. Statistical inference, for example, in pharmaceuticals, when we do clinical trials, many different types of trials are done, as you know.
Yes.
We collect a lot of data, and it's multifactorial data, and the statistical tools that are used, because pharmaceuticals is a regulated industry, and ultimately it is really creating a document that is approved by the FDA. That's objective function for a pharmaceutical company. They tend to use, at least from my perspective, fairly antiquated statistical methodologies, linear regressions, p-values, and in an industry which shows very high placebo effect for any trial, it's often very easy to get to that threshold, whatever threshold the FDA is looking for, by slight, changes in your methodology. I don't know in social sciences what the situation is.
So, I mean, you're right that when in formal pharmacological trials, the statistical methods used are not very sophisticated. But that's usually not because of a lack of sophistication, but in the method in of itself. It's more because when you're doing randomized control trials, You
Yeah.
don't really need, you don't even need necessarily regression. You can just do something as simple as basic t-tests, two sample t-tests, because if you've randomized your sample correct, you randomized your treatment and controls properly, then all you need is t-tests or
Yeah.
Mann-Whitney tests, or very simple parametric or non-parametric tests. However, um, uh, the, uh, the there are related problems both in pharmacological trials and outside pharmacological trials, which are based on the statistical methods used, which generate some of the errors that lead to scale-up effects. Just to give you a very simple example,
Yeah.
we have what's called the winner's curse in publication bias. So
Yeah.
let's say that I'm trying. If we take, let's say that there's a potential cure. Let's say for COVID-19, excuse me.
COVID-20 is coming, I think.
Yes, COVID-19. So there's a potential cure for COVID-19, and actually the reality is this is an ineffective cure.
Yeah.
But 20 different labs experiment with this cure, and according to traditional statistical inference, you'll reject, you'll gather data and conduct a hypothesis test and reject, and the hypothesis test will be set up so that there's a 5% chance of you thinking that there is an effect when there isn't actually effect.
Yeah.
A type 1 error. And so among the 20 places that try, on average, one of them should find that there is an effect when we know there isn't an effect, and 19 should correctly find there's no effect.
Right.
Now, among these, if all 20 of these labs try to disseminate their results and publish them and communicate them to the media and so on and so forth, the one that's going to get the most attention is going to be the one that says, hey, we found statistical evidence in favor of a cure.
Yes.
And the 19 that didn't are just going to be sort of swept under the carpet. If they are going to get published, then we publish in lower ranked journals and so on and so forth. So the problem is that when a scientist or a journalist then picks up this 1 out of the 20 results and reads it, they don't realize, or they don't behave as though this is the one that was published. There were 19 that failed. They only find in the literature that only one's been published, and it's this one. So they treat it as if it's much more likely to be true than it actually is.
Yes.
And this is, as I say, it's similar to what's called the winner's curse in auction theory, whereby if we're all bidding, if I told you there's an oil field, we don't know exactly how much oil there is, but we're going to bid for rights to extract oil from it. Then on average, the person that wins is going to be the one who overbid for that oil field, because when lots of people are bidding, the one who ends up bidding, the one who wins, is the one who overestimated the value of it. And that's something that's similar with the publication bias. So that's an example of an inferential problem. And it's not because the techniques are not high tech, it's because the data, there are assumptions about the way in which the data is presented that are not accurate. They think that this one study that found the result was representative of all studies conducted, when in fact it's not representative of all studies, and 19 out of the 20 studies found no effect, but they're not given the same media or scientific coverage.
Yeah. So more generally, Omar, then suppose we deploy 20 different experiments, not by humans but by a machine, maybe 20 different machines in a noisy random data field to prove a hypothesis. What you're saying is that one of those 20 by random chance is going to show power or show it to go effect, and we say let's pick that one because it shows effect. Yes. And other 19 never get the light of the day.
Right, and that's fine if when you read that the one that did find the result, you're aware of the existence of the 19. But the way in which scientific results are disseminated, both via academic journals and in terms of media coverage, the 19 don't get the same coverage, and so people who read that one result are unaware of of the 19 failures,
Right.
and that paves the road for an inferential error.
Yeah, so this is a big issue, right? So we have, I believe, something like 500 trials going on. 175 of them are in the vaccine area. I'm talking about COVID-19.
Right.
In a field of such intensity, it's very likely that we're going to find data that supports something because there's so many different experiments being run. And so, would you say, when you go into something like this with so many different experiments being run, our chance of actually finding something real is actually lower?
Well, so in the special case of pharmacological trials,
Yeah,
these inferential biases that I'm discussing are widely understood. And so there are protocols that companies have to follow
yeah,
in order to minimize the likelihood that these kind of errors are made. The simplest example being what's called pre-registration. So before a trial is conducted, there has to be a formal declaration that this trial is going to be conducted.
yeah,
So you can't have a situation where I keep doing the trial 10 times, and the one time it works is the one time I report it, and the 9 times it didn't work, I don't mention it.
right.
FDA and its analogs in all countries put very high inferential, and they require lots of replications. And so, in general, in pharmaceutical trials, the likelihood of these false positives is much lower than it is in social sciences,
Yeah,
because the authorities regulating and overseeing the deployment of these products are aware and have imposed protocols that decreases. But if we're going to do the same thing, let's say that as an alternative, we look at what is the effect of wearing masks on the transmission of COVID, which is somewhere between this mixture of social sciences and public health. But certainly, the research that is done on that area is not subjected to the same sort of rigorous protocols that are in pharmaceutical trials, and so we should expect to see what's called the Proteus effect.
yeah,
The Proteus effect being that you get, for example, some results that show, oh, it's positive because of this selected reporting of results. And then you get a bunch of papers being published saying, actually, no, there's no effect. And you sort of gyrate from people thinking there is an effect to people think there's no effect. Because once people are convinced there is an effect, it becomes attractive to publish a paper which says there's no effect. And
yeah.
then once everybody thinks there's no effect, it becomes once again attractive to publish a paper which says there is an effect. So you get these sort of swings from extreme to extreme, and certain aspects of COVID are likely to yield that. But when it comes to well-regulated pharmaceutical interventions, that's relatively unlikely.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Omar. So, it seems to me that if the outcomes are very measurable and objective, then those protocols work. But even in pharmaceuticals, in certain therapeutic areas like pain, for example, when the measurement is not very precise and objective, the chance of these types of errors are a lot higher. So I would imagine in social sciences arena, what we are measuring is not really precise most often, right?
So it's not so much as the imprecision as it is the lack of clarity on what the designated outcomes are prior to the start.
Yeah.
So if we take let's say that I'm doing a standard pharmaceutical trial on, let's say, cancer treatment. It's very clear in the cancer treatment, for example, what my outcome measures are going to be. Maybe it's years of life, or various well-defined measures of well-being, of health.
Yeah.
But if we take something a bit more vague that hasn't been studied very much, let's say I'm conducting a study to work out uh, what type of let's say drugs help people with their mental health issues during COVID.
Mhm.
Um, Here, the outcome measure, when I say mental health, well, mental health can mean many different things.
Right.
I could come up with 100 different measures of mental health. And it's not something where everybody's agreed, well, there's one or two certain measures. And so what that happens is that maybe if I run an experiment, 7 or 8 of those major measures, I find there's no effect. But if I keep cycling through my outcomes, I'll find one where there is an effect just randomly.
Yeah.
And that will be the one that I selectively report. And make it look like I found an effect, and then I'll selectively censor the data that I gathered on the other outcome measures, and to hide the fact that that I probably found a false positive. Whereas, as I say, in most medical trials, because the outcome measures are more systematized, there's less room for that sort of statistical gymnastics.
Right, right. So in the paper, so even if we take care of all those statistical inference problems in the lab experiment, the other issue that you go into is when you try to apply it at the policy level for a broad population, the properties of that population is going to be different from what is tried in the lab, and hence it's not really scalable, right?
Right, right. So, I mean, if you want a simple example, let's say that I was going to um, uh, look at, and this applies even in pharmacological trials.
Yeah,
Let's say that I was going to do looking for a cure for obesity or a treatment that helps people overcome obesity. Then at the beginning, I have to ask for some volunteers, and let's say it's some experimental new age thing. Who are going to be the people that are going to volunteer? Probably people who are, facing some sort of, life or death. Maybe if this doesn't work out for them, then they're facing serious health complications, or people who are, in a very bad situation and have a very strong incentive to do whatever they can in order to improve.
yeah,
So it wouldn't be surprising to find a very positive effect for this group. So then I find this positive effect, and then I conduct very sophisticated and rigorous statistical inference so that I don't fall into the traps we discussed at the start. Then I try to roll this out, and although obesity is a widespread problem, I'll find that when we implement the program, other people, because they're not as desperate as the people who volunteered, maybe aren't as committed to the program. Maybe they don't stick to it as much. Maybe they lose their commitment, and so it doesn't have the same effect on them. And then what's happening is that there's a systematic difference between the people who volunteered for the trial and the people who are going to be enrolled in the program after my trial has proved to be successful.
right. And so there's a biased selection problem in the lab, and and so so in social sciences, since it's not really regulated, these experiments, um, uh, isn't there more flexibility to make that population more, that sample, I should say, more representative, or is it because the investigator, so to speak, wants to show effect, and really creating a population that's more likely to show the effect?
So you've got several forces acting. One is one you described, which is that the scientists he has a limited budget, have limited resources,
Yeah,
and so if they've only probably got one chance to show this intervention works, and if they've only got one chance, they're going to look for the sample which is going to give them the best chance of it working,
yeah,
even if that means that this sample is unrepresentative, because they'll say, okay, we'll cross that bridge when it comes. But as a proof of concept, I at least want to show that there exists a subset of the population for which this is true.
right, right.
So that's active strategy by the scientist. But even setting that aside, even if the scientist is being is just taking whatever they can. First of all, you've got the issue of convenience,
Mm,
which is so I'm a social scientist, and in the university setting, we often do experiments on young adults, and this may or may not bias the results, but we go for it not because we do or don't think it biases, because this group happens to be convenient, it's cheap to recruit them, and so on and so forth. And if I've got a limited budget, if I wanted to do an experiment on, the effect of, for example, isolation on mental health,
Yeah.
then it's going to, in a university setting, it's going to be a lot cheaper for me to run this experiment on 21-year-old children, 21-year-old adults than it is for me to run it on people across all age groups, because I have to recruit people from outside the university in the latter case and pay them more and so on and so forth. Right. So sometimes just the fact that it's a convenient sample, and sometimes it's because we don't even know. I mean, whenever you take a sample, whatever method you use, you may unwittingly be taking a non-presenting sample. You may be trying to take away, but reality is, this is science, and we don't know. We're at the frontier, and we don't know what interacts with the characteristics of our sample. And the only way to find out is to do it, make the mistake, so to speak, and then learn from it.
Right. Yeah, this is really interesting, Omar. I don't know if this translates into social science. So, as you know, one of the trends in pharmaceuticals is toward personalized medicine, right? So, in effect, at the limit, you could say there is no common treatment. There is a treatment that can be personalized for an individual. And okay. So when you think about clinical trials, then you are then forced to look at subsets of the data to say, for this subset with this diagnostic companion, this therapy works. So you could actually come up with 10 different subsets with differing doses and differing administration. And one could actually argue that that might be even better in the long run, because no human is the same as another human. So this idea that you can mass manufacture a single dose medicine and shower it on a large population to get good effect is actually a false notion. Now, we don't know, we cannot really do that in a social science policy type arena, right?
So, I mean, no, actually, so what you're describing is not the typical case. I think ideally, we would love to be able to tailor our medical interventions to the level of the individual. But the reality is that there are economies of scale in delivering medical interventions, be they at the, because of the chemicals side of it, or even the administrative side of it. If I'm trying to do, for example, an alcoholic, something that helps alcoholics get over their deal with the problems, then it's very difficult for me to devise a tailored program. It's easy for me to have Alcoholics Anonymous sessions with hundreds of people where I deliver the same material. But on occasion, it is possible to tailor, and where possible, one would like to do that. And in social sciences, we do have something similar to some extent. To give you an illustration, we have programs for helping children improve their learning. At the very crudest level, it might be something that is just a function of your child's age group. If you're 3, if you're 4, do this. If you're in grade 1, do this, and so on and so forth. But the more sophisticated ones, which may be based on trials, will tailor to other characteristics of the child. For example, do they have any learning disabilities? Do they have certain skills, certain attributes which they're evolved compared to other children in their cohorts? Do they have certain time constraints, and so on and so forth? So tailoring does exist, but this is not something that's usually done at the cutting edge of science. This is more done as a sort of follow-up by technicians, because scientists tend to be more enamored with general rules and principles, rather than the sort of somewhat uninspiring follow-up work of working out how to tailor something to as various demographic attributes change. So that's why they don't get as much attention. But that sort of stuff definitely does go on in the background.
It might also be sort of unique technology for again, going back to pharmaceuticals, for personalized medicine to work, because the idea there is you have maybe AI-based techniques, you have diagnostics. So essentially, it can tell you X is different from Y, and custom tailor a program for eggs. So, it requires copious application of technology. But I think in the social sciences arena, the infrastructure that we have currently probably won't allow us to think about those types of things because, as you say in the paper, we are sort of on ground floor now. Lab experiments come out, it proves something, policymakers and the public looks at it and say it may not work for the whole population, and they discard it. They connect between what social scientists find and what policymakers ultimately implement. Now, a third bucket that you talk about in the paper, Omar, is properties of the situation. Could you elaborate on that as well?
Yeah, so I mean, it's got several sub-dimensions, but as an illustration, let's say that one example is rising costs. So let's say that I wanted to run a program where I stick with the education example, where I teach children after school.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, when I'm doing my trial, it should be relatively easy for me to get high quality teachers to enroll in the program because I only need a handful. But when I try to scale this up to, let's say, doing it at the level of a county, at the level of a city, a level of a state or a country, then I'm going to need hundreds or maybe even thousands of teachers. And procuring, thousands of high quality teachers, it's going to cost a lot more per teacher than it did when I was only hiring 3 or 4.
Right.
So one of two things happens: either I do maintain the same quality, but it's going to cost me a lot more, and that cost is going to go into the cost benefit calculation. So even though I get the same benefits, they're going to come at a much higher cost.
Yeah.
Or I decide to keep the cost per student the same. In that case, I'm just going to end up attracting lower quality teachers inadvertently, and then therefore the benefit of the program will decrease. So the result in both cases is that I'll find a lower effectiveness of the intervention as a direct consequence of scaling up.
Yeah. So are the costs going up at scale because you cannot find a large number of quality teachers?
So in this example, the process of finding high quality teachers is a costly one, and when I'm doing it at a small scale, maybe let's say I can actually get people. I may know the teachers if I'm the principal investigator. I may have a good relationship with the school principal, and I've got some willing volunteers. But all these different sort of the factors that allowed me to run the experiment are not scalable factors. And so, I may know a few teachers personally. To give an example, John List, who's one of the co-authors on the study, he's done a lot of experiments with some big companies, and a lot of those are feasible because he has a personal relationship with some of the high-ranking members of those companies.
Yeah.
And that's enough to get him the resources he needs within the organization to run the experiment. But if he was trying to do that at the same thing at the level of the country, he doesn't have enough relationships with people to procure talent at the same cost.
Right. Okay. I want to jump into another policy paper that you have that just came up. The listeners will be very interested in. It's entitled "Understanding How the Coronavirus Affects the Global Economy: A Guide for Non-Economists."
Right.
Could you give us the gist of what is in that paper?
Yeah, so the COVID obviously has been causing all sorts of health consequences and also very tangible economic consequences. But it can be some of those economic consequences are very clear. For example, people can't travel because there's lockdowns on international travel. Then whoever works in the airline industry is going to be, or tourism industry is going to be seriously affected.
Yeah.
Some of the impacts are more subtle. And so what this paper is about is helping people who are non-economists get to grips with all the sort of different types of short run and long run economic impacts that are being that are associated with COVID, so that they can getting a better understanding of what sort of countermeasures we should be considering.
Mhm, mhm. And so what do you think? There are some conflicting data. For example, some of the macro parameters that you look at, like unemployment, um, layoffs, companies going bankrupt, GDP growth, things like that, all seem negative. But we have a rising stock market,
Yeah.
and so how do you rationalize that?
That one's quite easy. Basically, there's two things that go together. One thing is that uh, um, most central banks have affected very large quantitative monetary stimulus programs. So what they're doing is effectively printing money
Yeah.
and using it in an attempt to both help banks and normal companies stave off bankruptcy, and also an attempt to stimulate the economy. Now, usually when the central bank prints money and gives everybody more money, then people will go out and use that money to buy goods and services, and that will lead to some increase in prices, because the economy will not be able to match the increase in demand with an increase in supply. So
Yeah.
that's why we usually expect when there's a monetary stimulus, there'll be some sort of price inflation. But in the case of COVID, first of all, people can't go out to spend a lot of their money.
Yeah.
And even if they can, they don't want to, because they don't want to go outside the house. And secondly, they're also very fearful of the future, so they'll want to save the money they're getting rather than spending it. And so, in both of those things lead to people looking to save their money, and rather than just putting it in the bank and getting zero interest, because interest rates are so low at the moment, they buy stocks, and that's what's causing the increased stock prices on the one hand.
Mhm.
And then on the other hand is that stock traders, speculators, they're not omniscient. They're humans just like the rest of us. They do have better knowledge than most of us, but they are largely just as clueless as anybody else is in terms of the long-term effect of COVID. So they don't know how to, what is a reasonable price for a stock, but they're seeing that there's a general trend of increase, so they're trying to ride that bubble and take home some profits. So that's kind of what's called herding behavior, combined with an asset bubble. So those two things are what's causing the increase in asset prices, and it's nothing to do with anyone seeing any good thing happening in the economy that's conflicting with the other indicators.
Right, right. So typically, from an efficient market hypothesis, we would think that players without a very high capital constraints could be on the other side of the trade, like hedge funds and so on. And so if you're seeing an asset price bubble that is not sustainable, those more sophisticated traders, I should say, should mediate that. But in this case, I think what you're saying, Omar, is that there is a notion that you cannot fight the Fed. It's a bit like the floodgates have been opened, and you can't really swim against it. So, is it possible that the more sophisticated traders are sort of out of the market?
I think that the sheer volume of liquidity being pumped into the markets at the moment is just without precedent. It's just 2008 and now the only times in history with this sort of liquidity being pumped in. And the Fed also signaled that it's not going to stop. It's just going to do
Yeah.
whatever it feels is necessary. So you have an open checkbook from the Fed. So if you've got this open checkbook from the Fed, then it's entirely rational to try to time the market if you've got a lot of capital, to take a risk timing the market. And that's what a lot of these hedge funds are, rather than being super. And at the same time, the alternative to stocks, which is traditionally bonds,
Yeah.
you've got bonds. The German bonds have got negative yields at the moment.
Right.
Because European interest rates have been at zero for about 3 years now, almost 4 years. So the alternative is very unpalatable, and inadvertently, the Fed and other central banks are pushing people into asset bubbles and stock market gambling by maintaining such low interest rates while pumping that much liquidity in.
Yeah. And the other alternative is, of course, real assets. And I read something that there is a massive real estate appreciation in China in the midst of the COVID as well. So that might also indicate there are very few things do with their money. And they cannot go out and buy stuff, so they cannot consume it. They cannot invest into fixed income securities. So you have stocks, and then you could potentially have some real assets like real estate.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, real estate is an alternative, and I'm sure some people are putting their money in real estate. But the problem with real estate is that it's not as easy. It's a much more lumpy asset. It's hard to buy a flat in Beijing and then a flat in London and a flat in Paris and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's a lot less liquid than stocks. So if you're looking to time the market, which a lot of these people are, then they need to have a liquid market.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Omar, if you were to speculate for the next couple of years, where do you think growth is going to be? Where do you think the global economies are sort of going to settle?
So I think that it's difficult to speculate until we have a clear. So I think a vaccine. It seems there's a good chance that a vaccine will come.
Yeah.
So if we get past, because there was still some uncertainty up until recently that whether it be a vaccine or not. People saying like HIV, we still don't have a vaccine for HIV. But if we are going to have a vaccine, then that definitely means that we have a hope of resuming, some degree of normality once that vaccine is widely available. So then the question comes, when will that vaccine become available? Because as you're seeing, the governments are not many very prosperous or very nominally very powerful governments are doing not a very good job of dealing with the health aspects of the COVID. So I think at the moment everyone is waiting for a vaccine because even if your country is managing to deal with the public health side of it well, it can't open its borders and it can't, go back to international travel and tourism and so on and so forth if this public health crisis is continuing. So I think, but now that the vaccine looks quite likely, and we can probably expect that sometime in the first half of 2021 is what I was reading today.
Yeah.
And so what I would expect is that from the second half of 2021, a resumption of rapid growth to make up for what's happened now. But we have a major problem in the long run, which is these huge public debts, and that's going to weigh heavily on growth. Because even if we do get the vaccine and we manage to avoid any other pandemics for the next 10, 15 years, the debt burden on some countries, many countries, has become very, very high, and that's going to drag growth back down until somebody comes up with a solution to these high public debts.
Yeah, so you would say then, arrival of a vaccine is a necessary requirement, at least for a tactical bump. But even in the presence of a vaccine, we're going to have long-term economic issues. And the problem with the vaccine also is that, flu vaccines are, let's say, 65% effective. Let's say we get a really good vaccine at 70% effective vaccine. And if compliance rates are as they are for flu, for 40, 50%, you don't really have herd level immunity coverage in the population with that. Mm-hmm. So, it seems difficult, right? I mean, we cannot get to herd immunity without a vaccine. That's very clear. And it is also unclear if we can get to herd immunity with the vaccine. And then, there are mutations to think about. Every year the flu is different. There are already indications that COVID-19 is mutating, which would then mean that it's a yearly cycle that you have to get in front of every year as well. So yeah, it's tough to speculate, but there appears to be a lot of headwinds for the global economies.
Yeah, and you've also got to add to that there's a growing anti-vaccine
Yeah.
movement. So some people, just flat out refuse to take a vaccine, and that number is increasing. So, but I think that once once a vaccine is available, the governments and societies have come to the conclusion that this lockdown and isolation and social distancing is so bad for mental health that they would rather either take the vaccine or not take the vaccine, but try to get life back to normal. Because the continuation of the current state is just gonna making life not worth living for many people.
On that note, it has been great. Thanks so much for the time that you spent with me, and good luck with all the policy research that you're doing.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Bye.